Hello, everyone. My name is Erik Bolin, and I'm introducing you to this webinar of the International Telecommunication Society on the future of mobility and digital connectivity and urban mobility. So, I'm past chair of the International Telecommunication Society, and it's my great honor to introduce to you in a little while Dr. Betsy Donald and John Lorinc. And let us consider what we are embarking on. First of all, good evening to those of you who are in Asia. Good afternoon for those who are in Europe, and good morning for those of you who are in North America and on the Eastern Standard Time Zone, or even Pacific, perhaps. Typically within this seminar, we are around 20 countries being as participants, and we've had a very good surge of registrations the last few weeks. So we're looking forward to share these perspectives with you. And so it's our great privilege that you are joining us. And regarding our community, the ITS, the International Telecommunication Society, this is a global community of, say, more than 400 members. And we provide a debate for the private sector, for government communities and academics to discuss pressing issues of the days within our concern, the digital future and the current state of affairs. And I would like also to extend my sincere thanks and gratitude to the ITS board and our corporate sponsors of ITS, and importantly to Queen's University, the Monk School, and the University of Toronto Press for this supporting this seminar. And moving to the topic of this occasion. First of all, cities, they are in some way the heart of the climate crisis because the cities host currently more than half of the world's population are concentrated in cities, and by 2050 we will have perhaps even 70%. And here it's where a lot of the transport and energy consumption is taking place. And so therefore, city planning is a challenge for finding the right future for the climate. But the digital technologies provide real opportunities here. Real-time transit systems, autonomous vehicles, and intelligent infrastructure. They are reshaping how we move and how we get around. But these technologies bring important policy questions, and these will be our concern today. Will, for instance, digital mobility solutions, will they really reduce emissions, or will they create new countervailing energy demands? Will there be a kind of a rebound effect in our the digital technologies in the cities? So complex causality there. Moreover, can we integrate ride-sharing, public transit, and autonomous vehicles in a way that prioritizes sustainability over convenience? How willing are we to work together, and how can policy support that? And how do we ensure that the future of our mobility serves all people, not just the wealthiest urban dwellers? How can we make sure that there is some equity in these potentials? These are some of the complex and critical questions that we will explore today. And now we're turning our attention to our wonderful speakers here. We have two distinguished experts whose work has shaped the way we think about urban mobility and smart transport. Dr. Betsy Donald is professor and associate vice principal of research at Queen's University. She will present insights from her book, Urban Mobility: How the iPhone, COVID, and Climate Changed Everything, exploring how digital transformation and behavioral shifts are redefining transport systems. And John Lorinc is an award-winning journalist and author whose work focuses on urban policy and technology and sustainability. He will discuss case studies and policy implications, and drawing from Professor Donald's book, as well as his own 2022 Writers' Trust winning award book, Dream States, Smart Cities, Technology, and the Pursuit of Urban Utopias. So we have some very well-informed speakers here who will interact in an interesting way. So Betsy, if I may say first name, will begin by outlining the key themes of our research, followed by a presentation of a case study by John. Then John will put on his journalist hat and interview Betsy about urban mobility. We will then open the floor for a lively Q&A discussion, who is moderated by Joe Rosell from TELUS, who's also one of the sponsors for this event. So this webinar is not just about autonomous vehicles, ride sharing, digital transit system. It's really about our future of our cities, our economies, and really about climate change, our planet. Choices we make today in urban mobility and infrastructure will shape our societies for generations to come. With that, I'll leave the screen and mic to Professor Donald, to you, and I will just disappear from sight. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eric, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, audience, for spending some time with us today. We really appreciate it. I want to also thank Joe and the International Telecommunications Society for sponsoring this. As Eric mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about the book that Dr. Shauna Brail and I co-edited on urban mobility: How the iPhone, COVID, and Climate Changed Everything. The book was published by the University of Toronto Press and was released in the fall in multiple formats, including an upcoming audiobook. I'm assuming everyone can see the screen and everything's working. I just wanted to start off by explaining how we're defining mobility in the book. We're talking about mobility in terms of the ability to move people well and effectively and safely from one place to another within cities. We didn't look so much as mobility between cities, but how people get to work within their own city, engage in recreational activity, leisure activities, visit their friends and family as effectively and efficiently as possible. So the quality of mobility really matters. And of course, mobility is essential to urban life. And I really liked, Eric, your introduction where you really talked about the future of our cities, our climate, our planet really depends on these systems of mobility. It's really about living and life and the quality that we have in our living everyday life. So I just wanted to start by explaining what motivated us to write this book. And it was really this trilogy of factors coming together, technology, COVID, and climate, where we thought, we need to kind of think about this and how this is challenging 21st century mobility right now. Technology, of course, as symbolized by the iPhone or smartphone and its connection to tracking technologies, is really is a symbol of the ways in which new technologies are facilitating disruption in the way mobility works within cities. Some of these disruptions, like the ride hailing that came about in Canadian cities in 2012, 13, 14, was very disruptive and really I think it was disruptive because it addressed a problem that was existing, but then sometimes there's problems that don't have a solution, or a solution looking for a problem, and we'll talk about that a bit more. The second major theme, of course, is the pandemic and the associated lockdowns. And in Canadian cities, especially in Eastern Canada, we had some of the most prolonged lockdowns in the world. And we're actually still recovering from some of these, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then the third feature, which Eric mentioned, of course, is the urgent need for us to address climate change. Urban transportation, as we know, makes up almost in Canada 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to pay attention to that. So let's just talk a little bit more about what we mean by technological change. And the invention of the smartphone really opened up huge opportunities for new ways of moving around the city. We saw disruptive technology companies like Uber and Lyft coming into the Canadian landscape, as well as the rise of lots of micro mobility options, including e-bikes, e-scooters, auto share, and all these things led to new options for improving mobility in Canadian cities. Some of these were seen as economic development generating, and some of them, in fact, were taking away from local economic development opportunities. And they weren't always tied to better transportation, and we'll talk about that a bit more. The second theme of the book is about COVID and the recovery. And I just want to highlight the chart on the left, the moon-shaped ones, where we tracked ridership over a 5-year period. 2019 is the benchmark. And you can see that starting with the lockdowns in cities like Toronto and New York, you would see in 2020, 37% and 38% of ridership to the pre-COVID levels. And it has obviously improved over time. But a recent Stats Canada data source that just came out a few days ago, reporting on Canada's January 2025 urban transit, shows that we're still 82% of the 2019 ridership. So this, of course, has implications for financing the operating of public transit in Canadian cities. The third theme, of course, is the idea that a quarter of urban transportation in Canada is that urban transportation is a major emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. So we simply have to find more sustainable ways of moving around, whether that be for longer trips through light rail transit or rail lines, buses, or last mile options, where the design of the cities will make them more walkable for cycling and other modes. Here's an outline of the book. It's bookmarked by an introduction and a conclusion, but there's 3 major sections of the book, each with about 100 pages in length, with multiple stories and multiple authors. The first is a big picture approach. The second focuses more specifically on examples of micromobility and other options and places and some of the patterns and challenges. And then the third addresses some of the policy questions. Starting with the big picture, we see that a lot of the authors in this section really emphasize the relationship again between mobility and quality of life. There's a chapter by Cavalli and McGann that shows how isolating COVID has been and really the lingering and lasting impacts, especially around social isolation, the inability of people to get back into the office, still a desire to work from home, and some of the profound mental health challenges that we have seen. People are craving not just mobility, but also proximity to other people, connections, whether that's sitting in a coffee shop while you're doing your work or going to the theater or just people watching. People want social connections. And these connections, of course, are fundamental to what makes a great city. You connect with your environment, you connect with your community, whether this community is well known to you or kind of strangers. It all creates a sense of well-being, and this is kind of the essence of good urban life. So in terms of making that work, of course, land use planning really matters. And this is something that some of the authors emphasize as well. You can't just overlay transit experiments on an auto-dependent sprawl-like landscape. And of course, in Canada, we are probably the most challenged that way because our cities really boomed during the post-war auto-dependent era. The other emphasis in a lot of the chapters is just more integration with all the multiple modes. That is just so essential, whether you're linking the public transit with walking, biking, ride hailing, buses, trains, all those things. There's also an excellent chapter by Tara Vinodre at the University of Toronto where she compares and contrasts the benefits of both private and public data on urban mobility. And of course, the private sector can come up with much more just-in-time data, but it's also not very consistent. And at the end of her chapter, she really calls for consistent public data is really essential to attract progress in urban transportation. And as new private technologies come into the urban space, it becomes increasingly difficult for us to understand what's actually happening around urban mobility. The last 2 points are more my reflections since writing the book. I think self-driving vehicles may or may not be the best choice, particularly because the incredible amount of energy that is required to generate them. And I think we also have to remind ourselves of what somewhat of a bizarre term called autonomous vehicles. The only true autonomy is freedom, I think, from tracking technology networks. Walking in a city without access to cell phones or any kind of larger network is probably the most autonomous you'll ever feel. And of course, I'm old enough to remember life pre-internet, pre-cell phone, and the wonderful times I had when I left home and moved to the big city of Montreal and just wandered the streets and took it all in. And it's just such a wonderful feeling of freedom and true mobility. So moving on to the middle half of the book is an area where we have lots of different authors focusing on different aspects of mobility. We've got chapters on ride hailing, food hailing. We have examples of car share in Montreal, Communauto, and their Bixi program. We have a really good chapter going through all the typologies of mobility. There's a chapter on e-scooters in Calgary, some discussion about demand responsive transit, as well as other chapters on self-driving cars, such as Waymo in San Francisco and other cities. Now, one of the key themes that really comes through in a lot of this writing is the central role that equity plays in any kind of transportation plan. This is really actually core when you're thinking about planning a good transportation system in a city. There's a paper by Palm and Farmer, which is a really excellent paper looking at the relationship between equity and public transit and the COVID pandemic in the Greater Toronto Area. And basically, they argued that the pandemic really altered transit along the lines squarely of social economic privilege and social spatial advantage. And what they mean by that is that in the Greater Toronto Area, most of the transit-rich locations are actually in those sites of greatest gentrification and the sites of the highest income earners. So when the COVID pandemic hit and lockdowns hit, the people that were able to work from home were also the ones closest to the best transit options. Unfortunately, the people that had to go to work and who were on the front lines working in the factories, the hospitals, the long-term care homes, the grocery stores, they tended to be living in transit poor areas, but they still needed to take public transit. And those were the people, the new immigrants to Canada, the racialized communities, many low-income people that didn't have cars or seniors who actually just kept taking public transit despite the lockdowns and the encouragement of the government not to take it. They had no other choice. So they were the ones that never stopped using it through the pandemic. The next section of the book focuses on governing mobility. And so there's lots of examples from other countries as well as from Canada. There's examples from Finland, US, Europe, really looking at how different local governments, provincial, state, or federal, look at mobility. Some really enable, for example, private sector technological experiments. Others discourage them. But there's this overall sense of that when the private sector comes into the urban space, there's pressing need for more coordinated processes to guide the private technologies. Some cities have said you can come in, but we're going to try and extract some benefits from you in terms of data sources, or others that can help us improve the overall transportation system. So this section of the book really highlights the importance of some kind of coordinated and well thought through approaches. And for example, there's the mobility as a service concept, which John Lawrence is going to talk about. So I'm going to leave that for his discussion. And then I'm just going to maybe conclude my section now to talk about how important this is really the moment now for us to build a better future. We know that in the Canadian case, our auto-dependent development patterns are simply not working. The social and natural environment is too fragile. There's a desperate need for multi-jurisdictional and multi-sector approaches. Everyone has a role to play, the private sector with their innovative ideas, the nonprofits with their deep knowledge of the local environments, and of course, governments who can think more broadly in terms of equity, climate, and justice. We see a lot of solutions coming into the urban space, but sometimes they don't necessarily have a problem attached to them. So solutions must really pertain to an identified mobility problem without creating new problems. So just to end, saying it doesn't help to bring a lot of technology into an urban landscape if it's not actually addressing some of the fundamental concerns that we're trying to address around equity, ensuring less pollution and more sustainability and inclusive places. So I'll leave it there and pass it over to John. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to participate. I'm going to share my screen, I hope. And oh yeah, there we go. So what I'm going to talk about is a case study, which I did some reporting on, both before and during the pandemic, mobility as a service. And, there's some interesting lessons on both ends of this case study on how this idea sort of, kind of got some traction, definitely some interest from mobility entrepreneurs. And then, what became of it. And then I could talk a little bit about about some of the lessons learned to date. Um, okay, so, okay. So, first, a little bit about what we're talking about when we talk about mobility as a service. So I just want to pause and say that the as a service concept is, became very popular in, technology and technology adjacent businesses. Software as a service is sort of the dominant business model in a lot of software businesses, enterprise software, cloud software, and so on. And so in the sort of mid 2010s, which seems like an eternity ago, there were a handful of entrepreneurs who started thinking about mobility as a service, and the idea was to create a platform, which would be a digital platform that would allow people moving through the city to kind of purchase their trips digitally in sequence, and adjusted to, obviously their routes and the most expedient way through, and to do this through a subscription model. And the inspiration of this was was telecom and cellular service and smartphone service, where you could, you buy a subscription, and you get so many minutes and you get so many texts and you get so much bandwidth, and you can alter these, right? You can choose, if you use one type of service more, you can buy that subscription package, or if you use a lot of international calling, you can use that kind of service. And so the idea was to create a subscription where urban dwellers could spend several $100s a month, and they would buy their mobility, and that package might contain a certain number of uh, transit tickets, or transit passes. It might provide a certain number of trips on bike share, car share, and you could actually go in as a consumer and select different packages. And what you would do is you would pay one fee on a monthly basis, and then you could book your journey on this platform and travel accordingly. And the platform would perform these functions that we've become accustomed to with Waze and Google Maps and so on, where it would optimize your trip through an urban area. And with the extra feature that it would not only optimize your trip, but it would provide you with uh, different mobility modes as you travel through. So it might be the fastest way is to take a subway for the first leg of your trip, and then you switch to a bike share, and then you switch to a car share for the last mile, this kind of thing. The idea originated in Helsinki with the WIM platform, which was created by a company called MaaS Global, and has been sort of rolled out in different jurisdictions, mostly in Europe, but with some pilot projects in North America. And so these include Berlin and Vienna, and they continue to operate. So the idea, as I mentioned, was that the is that you want to optimize urban travel, and you do it through this technology, this platform. And why do you want to do that? Well, this technology was very much motivated by carbon consciousness, and finding ways of moving through urban space with using a minimum of carbon, an emphasis more on transit and on micromobility, and uh, as opposed to the private automobile, and also pushing a modal shift um, away from the private automobile to these other modes. And as I think many of you on the call will be very aware, that the conversation around modal shift really varies heavily in region to region. And there, in North America, the modal splits between transit and the private automobile are very poor. In other places where there's denser, or urban areas are denser, better provisioned with transit, the modal split is much better. And obviously, the last part of this is leveraging the smartphone and leveraging all the mapping that it's capable of doing, as well as the other features that we're familiar with, which is, the e-commerce features, where you can carry out these transactions from your phone, do it automatically, do it through the subscription service. So this was sort of the idea behind the MaaS business concept. So there were a number of structural obstacles that the early players faced. One was consumer take-up. So you have to persuade people who are just going about their daily lives to switch the way they buy transit. So, buy their mobility. So, moving from, buying a monthly transit pass, for example, or to a subscription model where you have access to a bunch of different modes, that's a significant consumer decision. And so these companies had to market the viability of MaaS as as an alternative. There are obviously the technical and privacy issues. The MaaS seems to work best when when the network effect is very much working for it. So you have lots of different private and public sector providers who are plugged into the platform. And that, of course, raises questions about the integration, between companies that are very advanced from a technological point of view to organizations that may be less advanced, legacy transit agencies. You have to deal with the payments issue. You have to deal with privacy and privacy issues, which are very much paramount in any technology framework which tracks where people move, right? So you want to ensure that there's a blood-brain barrier between my choice of getting from my house to a health clinic, and what the various technology providers and the mobility providers on the other end of that journey can see and learn about me. Finally, and most significantly, there's the transit agency resistance. So and this was this is something I'll come back to, but the question that the transit agencies had was what's in it for me in an institutional sense, right? Because they faced the potential of a loss of ridership, even though what the MaaS companies were offering was a more efficient way of moving through space. So the interests of the MaaS companies and the transit agencies were not perfectly well aligned. There was the other issue, which is that, many, though not all, transit agencies, are very reluctant or just simply do not wholesale their transit passes to third parties. And the whole MaaS business model presupposes that the MaaS providers can acquire, tickets in bulk or passes in bulk, and then use those as part of the subscription package. So those were some of the issues that the early MaaS providers had to contend with. Um, and so in the chapter that I wrote in this book, I kind of grappled with four key questions. Does MaaS provide urban mobility through this kind of connectivity? Does it improve congestion, accessibility? Does it reduce carbon emissions in an urban area? What are the conditions, the preconditions, and the service design that will allow public transit agencies to benefit from participating in a private MaaS platform? And this was, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is very significant because the MaaS platforms were basically entrepreneurial startups. They were small companies, they were privately financed, and they were trying to partner with large legacy transit operators, many of which operate as monopolies in their territories. Uh, and this was a pretty unequal kind of uh, uh, partnership or pairing that proved to be difficult later on. How is success defined? Um, the As I mentioned, the idea behind the early MaaS service providers was to find a way of optimizing urban travel and urban mobility using this technology and using the different mobility options that are on offer in an urban area, while minimizing the use of the private automobile. And so their idea of success was a one that was very much defined by, you know, regional or citywide metrics such as modal split, and the ability of the willingness of consumers to sort of buy into these subscription models as a way of, as sort of a market signal that individuals wanted to optimize their personal travel with this broader goal in mind. And finally, this question of whose interest is served. The earliest mobility as a service providers were private companies, and they have a profit motive. Um, but the profit motive was not their only motive. They saw this technology as a way of, achieving these other goals that I've just mentioned. Um, at the same time, they are private firms, and one of the questions that comes up in the whole discussion of MaaS and the way it was implemented is, should there only be one mobility as a service platform within a regional, within an urban region or city region, or are there going to be competing ones? There's no reason why there shouldn't be competing ones. But then you've got this question about the commercial and, profit motives between the various players. So since the book came out, the following happened. WIM, which was the most sort of high-profile MaaS company, and had raised quite a lot of money through various private placements and funding rounds, declared bankruptcy last year, and almost I guess a year ago. And so this was an interesting development. It sort of puts a period at the end of my story, because it showed that there were a lot of investors who were very taken with the idea of MaaS. They raised several $100 million in financing. It was very much a 2010s technology play. It had all of the elements of the kind of technology plays that were popular and were seen to be sort of benign and progressive in the period before the pandemic. What they couldn't the circle they were unable to square was that they couldn't find enough consumers who were willing to sign up with the subscription model, and they, like other private MaaS operators, were very challenged in persuading the legacy transit operators to sort of get on board. The ones that have survived, Jelby and VN Mobile, are owned and operated by regional transportation authorities. And this is, I think, a very significant detail because they situate the municipality or the regional government at the sort of top of the pyramid. And and it is appropriate that the regional municipality or the regional government or the municipality be the one that has um, the concern for advancing, um, the, maximum efficiency in the transportation system in the city, in advancing, policy goals like, shifting the modal split, reducing carbon, and so on. And while the technology and the platform clearly has benefits, it's it's clear that it was best the the best way of operating was through a municipal entity, and the ones that have survived have that feature. They also, as happens with every technology and digital technologies in particular, there's sort of been an evolution, and in Berlin, certainly, one of the evolutions is the development of hubs where the different types of mobility options are sort of physically, sort of concentrated. So you can get to, a U-Bahn stop or an S-Bahn stop, get off, and there's the Jelby hub, and then you can, right there, and then you can find your bike or you can find your shared vehicle and move fairly seamlessly. And that seems to have been a very important feature that was not envisioned in the initial versions of the MaaS business model. So just very briefly to conclude, some of the lessons: build it and they will subscribe is not given, and the idea behind the technology was very elegant, and but it sort of it preceded consumer demand, and I think that this was an important detail. The other thing is that travel habits don't necessarily sort of work that well with these kind of platforms and the subscription model. Many people, when they travel through an urban space, do it in a very predictable way and do it over and over again. It's work trips or trips to and from an educational institution. And so the individual can actually optimize that trip on their own without a subscription model, and may not need the options to get from, my place to, my home to my work, because the most direct alternative is the most direct option is the one that they always use. Um, the the final point, I think that's important, is that the private operators were unable to sort of make inroads with the transit operators, um, and this was for a bunch of reasons that I've described before, but the alignment was not the alignment wasn't present the um, because the increase in the use of MaaS platforms did not necessarily benefit transit operators. And so for those cities where the MaaS has become a sort of a, part of the municipal, transit operation, uh, they can allow for that, they could allow for that fact. But when you've got a situation where a private entity is basically competing with a transit operator, the transit operator is, very much in the driver's seat, if you pardon the pun. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and then we can have some discussion, and then open it up for questions. So okay, so Betsy, I'm going to jump in, and um, I want you to sort of catch us up to where we are at this moment, right? So we're a couple of years past the pandemic. We have, you know, we have a lot of, a lot of the transit agencies around the world have recovered, as your graph showed. So if you at a high level, where are we when it comes to the interplay between mobility and technology in our cities, just at a high level? And then I'll ask you some more detailed questions.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think we've definitely, we were accelerating before the pandemic, definitely, I think. And then it put such a pause. I still think we're limping along. Even though we've almost recovered, we haven't grown. So that, at a high level especially in the Canadian context. So we're not bringing in new players into the public transit space. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. I think obviously the elephant in the room in the Canadian context is the Canada-US relationship, which has really sparked a new rise of Canadian sovereignty, which one of the really interesting things, it's all about Buy Canada. Even in the city of Toronto, I noticed don't take Uber because it's an American company. I think there's this recognition that we have to find our own solutions. And I've always thought that anyway with public transit, we have to understand our own physical geography, our own culture, our own places. So it seems to me that some of the most successful cities have actually developed their own systems on their own by taking into consideration, as you mentioned, those larger policy issues about a low carbon city and equity and, those bigger policy questions. So I would say that if you look at the success stories, it's really the cities themselves in their accompanied, jurisdictional frameworks that are driving the change that works for their place. It's very place-based. And there's a huge potential, I think, for the role of the private sector in innovation and kind of private sector that understands the local geography, community economy. So I guess it's like opportunity time,
Right.
really.
So if I have to think about how mobility changed during the pandemic, and like a really big example, it would be the incredible growth in micromobility, and
Mhm.
particularly, e-bikes and e-scooters and all, an extraordinary range. And many of those technologies and modes are connected digitally in some way. And I'm wondering if you could reflect on the lesson of that, because there have been some ways in which the use of these devices has produced unintended consequences, and has challenged, municipal authorities. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, like I think that's in the book. There's a lot of that in the book. And, we did see throughout the pandemic a lot of experimentation, e-bike services coming into some communities. But if they didn't have the accompanying infrastructure or the kind of any kind of ways in which to monitor that, those tended to fail. So in my community, Kingston, Ontario, a lot of international companies came in, and then it just led to stealing and waste, and they left. There was no plan. But then those places like Montreal that really made a concerted effort to create bike lanes and create their own Bixi bike program, which of course, even the bikes are built close by in Montreal. That's kind of a really good example of a system that really works well. It had its starts and stops, but your question was they can they can provide like a really good last mile options for people. Recently, a woman by the name of Lisa Friedman, who writes about disability research, contacted us to say, you know, you didn't have a lot on people with disabilities in your book. And I said, I know that was a shortcoming, which we're going to try and alleviate with her. And hopefully we're in the process of pulling together another chapter that we will add on the online platform. But she raised some really good points about, I mean, obviously these are difficult for people in wheelchairs if they're all left over the sidewalk. So there's a lot of unintended consequences that haven't been planned out. But having said that, certainly we've seen a lot of success too, like in Toronto with the huge growth of bike use during the pandemic because people could isolate as well as get traveling where they want to go. And as that system increases more sites and docks, it's really grown the use of it. So there are lots of good examples as well.
Um, so on the accessibility disability question, if are there a couple of examples or an example that, that has crossed your radar about um, an interplay between, accessibility technology and connectivity, digital technology?
There's lots of examples. Yes, I mean, I'm just thinking about what, depending on the kind of, there's been huge advances for so many people to be able to access new technologies to improve their quality of life depending on their disability. So there's lots of good stories around that. Better wheelchairs, better ways of communicating using technology. I mean, in some ways, it's been a lifesaver for so many members of disability groups. But there's also challenges as well. So I think, for example, Lisa was talking about a lot of the ride hailing has never been, it doesn't work for people in wheelchairs necessarily, but we still haven't invested in making our transportation systems accessible.
And the ride hailing is an interesting example because some taxi authorities, municipally run taxi authorities, mandate a certain number of wheelchair accessible cabs, but this is not the case for the private ride hailing companies. Um, okay, so let me just change topics a little bit. This is a very speculative question. So uh, we had like a whole long conversation about electric vehicles and their potential and, retrofitting apartment buildings with chargers and all of that stuff. And in the last couple of years, uh, we've seen this extraordinary growth in capital investment in in AI data processing centers, which are incredibly uh, they're real, energy consumers. And I'm wondering to get your thoughts on whether we're moving into a world where there's going to be competition between the energy demands of AI and LLMs and the energy requirements for mobility in a post-fossil fuel world. Um, just
Yeah.
a little question.
Well, critical minerals.
Yeah.
You can't really look at critical minerals without looking at, again, the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a reason why, Greenland is of interest, Canada's of, there's like all this happening because it's directly tied to the AI economy. I just think we're sleepwalking. We need to pay more attention to these things and make some, again, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Like again, thinking about the cities, if the cities are the major focus here, what are we trying to do? We're trying to get as many people in the city moving around as efficiently, as effectively, as as safely, as inclusively as possible. That's what we have to start with. That's the question. That's the fundamental question. And then from there, Okay, what role does AI play? What role does just simply planning our city so it's easier to walk, or zoning them so that you can have corner stores and subdivisions so people can go get a popsicle or milk, without getting in their car. So there's just a lot of more fundamental questions I think we have to be asking. And I'm a planner by training, so I'm
Yeah.
just more interested in how to make our cities work. And I'm not so enamored by the latest technological advancement. There's some wonderful things that technology does. Of course, we're on the screen right now having this wonderful
Right.
conversation. But I think that we have to really ask ourselves, what is the problem we're trying to solve?
Okay, so the last question I'll ask you, and then we can open it up, is a planning question. So it seems to me that cities are sort of um, pulling in different directions when it comes to um, decarbonizing mobility. So on the one hand, we have these examples, and there are not too many of them, but like Paris,
Mhm.
just in the last couple of days, had this referendum to further, you know, remove vehicles from, I think, 500 kilometers of urban streets, which is a remarkable example and builds on what they've done with cycling and transit and so on. And then on the other hand, you have cities that are, that where there's increased pressure to sprawl, where you
Mhm.
have experiments like, bike lanes in the city of Toronto being ripped out, or Donald Trump ordering the end of the uh, uh, um, sorry, the payment system for Lower
Mhm.
Manhattan.
Yeah.
And so it feels like the world is becoming more polarized in
Mhm.
this sphere. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I agree. I mean, how come it became so politicized? Why did it become so politicized? Everything is now, but it just seems like this is not helpful. It's like sometimes I think in North American cities, why is biking so politicized? Why are people always having to make a statement about biking? Why can't we just bike? I used to live in Cambridge in the UK, and everyone just biked to work and the kids biked to school and everyone just biked. No one was wearing fancy clothes and signs on their backs, but it was just, it was just the most efficient way to get around. So I think that it's unfortunate that we're seeing this like this politicization in our urban landscapes. Again, it gets back to what works for what cities. I mean, obviously, Paris is a phenomenal city that everyone wants to go to. Why? Because it's walkable, because it's, authentic, because it's beautiful, because you can have these wonderful urban experiences. Similarly, Manhattan is exciting. You want to walk around, take in the sights. Um, so I don't know. I wish we could if we could get back to more rational thinking and just practical thinking about, okay, how can we improve the city for everyone?
Okay. I think that's a good place to open it up to questions. Whoever's monitoring Joe, can.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks so much for that, Betsy and John. What a treat, especially at the back end, to hear you guys kind of talk through some of the issues that you raised during the presentation. So we have a couple questions. We have three questions already from the audience. So the first one is to both of you. What about smart traffic lights as a way to optimize mobility?
Ooh, love that. I just couldn't agree more. That is actually a brilliant, and to me, that is so connected to your understanding of how your city works. We had a closed bridge in our community, and the city decided to implement smart lights to get more effective flow. It just, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And to me, that's very much rooted in using technology cleverly to really address the issues of where you're talking about. So yes, I don't know. That was my
I
enthusiastic response.
So I would add, and there's a whole bunch of technology that's sort of, being implemented on that score. There's a firm in Waterloo, Ontario that does a lot of that kind of technology. The I think the policy question above this is about how do you measure, like, what constitutes efficient movement through a traffic light, right? Is it number of vehicles? Or is it throughput, like the number of bodies that are moving through that particular intersection? And how do you optimize for those? And those are slightly not slightly. They're very different questions, and they're policy questions as opposed to technology questions.
Great, great. Thanks for that. Our next question here is asking if both Betsy and John could opine on whether digital connectivity within cities is actually widening the digital divide for marginalized, disabled groups, or for folks who can't afford smartphones and mobility as a service.
Absolutely. That to me is one of the biggest drawbacks. And again, that's where I'm always emphasizing, start with the problem, which is we need to make sure everyone has access to good mobility options. And I do worry about that as well. That's one of the, there's lots of empirical evidence showed the link between the rise of dependence on digital technologies and the growing inequalities. And that's in our book. There's lots of examples of that in evidence.
Yeah, I agree. I'd agree with that. I'd just say that that I mean, the other part of that is that that mobility providers often increasingly default to the assumption that somebody's carrying a phone, right? So you can check your phone to find out when the bus comes or when, the train schedules and so on. And even call centers are being replaced by AIs. So, so that's the assumption that I think a lot of, transit operators and municipalities have now.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. So the next question asks about smart mobility in the context of areas that are very mountainous, but I think this could be generalized to like what's the potential for smart mobilities in places where there's challenging geography, topography, or where communities are very far apart, like they are in Canada, but in all their parts of the world as well.
Yeah, I think I don't have any expertise in that, only that's something that we do have a lot of, like we were talking about that earlier, Joe, and especially in Canada, within a lot of remote, rural and Indigenous communities are really looking for alternatives and options. And I just had a conversation recently with a really important Indigenous leader in Canada who's really trying to improve mobility, access to digital access to a whole load of communities in Northern Ontario, which will, so yes, that I think I don't know enough about that, but it's certainly a demand.
But the point I'd make is that a lot of it turns on the ability of remote communities to access affordable electricity and clean electricity. So, the move away from diesel generators and from dirty sources of electricity is paramount. And there's actually a ton of technological innovation focused on this, and in northern areas in Canada, of which most of Canada is remote and northern. And it's quite encouraging that you'd be able to have clean electricity, and then you can start to think about about low carbon mobility, which like truth be told is very, very challenging in a big country with wide open spaces where you could drive for 7 hours between cities in northern Alberta, and the challenge of creating any kind of transit service in that environment is huge.
Okay, great. So the next question here basically suggests that like during the pandemic, I mean, people began teleworking, undertaking distance learning, and then as we anticipate virtual reality and augmented reality becoming more ubiquitous, it could be the case that it becomes the transportation of goods rather than people that will account for the biggest share of transportation and transportation emissions overall. So the question is sort of like in a world where this is the case, what do you think mobility as a service in cities will look like when people are taking advantage of those sort of behavioral changes that are enabled by technology?
Yeah, well, we did a chapter on that, from ride hailing to food hailing, in the book, where we looked at that pivot that happened. It was really interesting. It's since gone back. So I'm not, yeah, I don't know. I mean, are we all just going to sit on our phones for the rest of our lives? It just feels like I'm kind of really hopeful. I teach at a university. I see a lot of actually youth rejection of all of this.
Mm.
People looking, the most exciting things are going for a hike, getting rid of your phone, turning it off, going to meet people, not getting tracked. So I don't know. Part of me is a little hopeful that we are actually going to push back a bit from a lot of this and kind of embrace alternatives. I mean, if you think about Paris, the way they just voted to stop cars, it's really about I want to get out in the streets. I want green space. I want to meet up my neighbors for coffee and wander around and enjoy local, non-chain stores and restaurants and something authentic to place. So I kind of think I'm hopeful that actually we'll see the opposite.
Yeah.
I don't see a future where most people just retreat to their apartments or their houses. Especially in very dense urban areas like, the big mega cities, very dense places like Athens, or it doesn't seem plausible that everybody would just wait at home. Even with Amazon and, with all of that e-commerce stuff, we're social animals, right? So we're gonna go out.
Great, great. So we're just 1 minute over time, so we'll kind of end it there. So I mean, on behalf of the ITS of Queens and Monk School and everybody in attendance, we're very grateful, Betsy and John, for you taking time and delivering really excellent presentations, and then having a fascinating, quite deep and profound conversation overall. And also, we're extremely grateful to all the people who registered and joined us today for this really interesting and super important conversation for Canadians, but I mean people all around the world as well. So thank you to everyone who participated and joined today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much, Joe. And please reach out anyone with any questions on the book.
Bye, everybody.